The mountain air tasted of ice and pine. I was pruning the winter roses when the heavy SUV tires crunched against my gravel driveway. The engine died with a final, oily rattle. Bianca stepped out, her designer coat gleaming against the snow. "We heard you bought a luxury villa in the Alps. We came to live with you and make peace," my daughter-in-law declared at my door, pushing her luggage inside. I didn't block them. But when they walked into the main hall, they stopped cold at what they saw. They said at the same time, "Where is the furniture?" Silas stood behind her, his face pale and eyes darting toward the vaulted ceiling. They expected velvet drapes and golden sconces. Instead, they found rows of narrow iron cots and a long, scarred wooden table. The air smelled of rosemary and antiseptic. Not expensive perfume. My son gripped the handle of his suitcase until his knuckles turned white. He looked for a place to rest his pride. I watched the realization sink in. This was not a playground for the rich. It was a fortress built for the broken. Bianca dropped her leather bag on the stone floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the vast, quiet space. She walked toward the north wall, her heels clicking aggressively. Dozens of framed photographs stared back at her. These were not family portraits or vacation snapshots. They were faces of women with bruised eyes and haunted smiles. Every image was a testament to a life reclaimed from the shadows. Bianca reached out to touch a frame, but her hand began to tremble. My quiet sanctuary suddenly felt like a courtroom. I stepped into the light, my shadow stretching across the cold floor. Silas tried to find his voice, but it came out as a weak rasp. He started to explain the debts and the frantic phone calls from the bank. I didn't care about his excuses or his corporate lies. I pointed toward the kitchen where three women stood watching in silence. They wore simple work clothes and carried the weight of earned wisdom. They were my real family now. Silas realized he was a stranger in his mother's own house. The tension in the hall became a physical weight. I handed Bianca a bucket and a heavy scrub brush. Her jaw dropped as she looked from the plastic tool to her manicured nails. I told them the rules of the villa clearly. Here, no one eats unless they work. No one sleeps unless they contribute to the collective peace. Silas looked at the door, then at the freezing mountain peaks outside. They had no money and nowhere else to go. The predator had finally walked into a trap of its own making. Night began to swallow the peaks, casting long, blue shadows through the high windows. I led them toward a small, unheated room in the back. It contained two thin mattresses and a single flickering lamp. There were no silk sheets or mountain views here. This was the room where the newest arrivals began their long journey of humility. I closed the heavy oak door and turned the iron key, leaving them in the small room. They were safe, but they were not guests. For the first time in decades, I held the only key to my life. The heavy iron bolt slid home with a metallic snap. Silas pounded on the oak once from inside the back room, but the thick wood swallowed his protest. I stood in the dark corridor, listening to the muffled whispers of my own blood. They were terrified of the cold and the quiet. I felt no guilt as I walked toward the communal kitchen. The floorboards didn't creak under my feet. I had learned to move like a ghost in my own home. My sanctuary remained safe for now. The scent of brewing chamomile filled the warm kitchen air. Three women sat at the long table, their faces illuminated by a single candle. Luna was nursing a cup of tea, her eyes fixed on the door. She didn't ask who was locked in the back room. She already knew the look of a woman who had finally closed a door on her past. Margaret pushed a plate of dark bread toward me. We sat in a silence that felt heavy and thick. "They won't stay quiet for long," Margaret whispered. She was the oldest resident and saw the world through sharp, wary eyes. I tore a piece of bread, focusing on the rough texture. I told her that silence was no longer their choice to make. They had arrived with demands, so I would give them duties. The villa functioned on a strict clock. Everyone had to earn their place in this mountain circle. If they refused to work, they would simply starve. A sharp crash echoed from the back of the house. It sounded like a ceramic pitcher shattering against the stone floor. Bianca was throwing a tantrum in the dark. I didn't move to check on them. Instead, I pulled a ledger from the shelf and opened it to a marked page. It contained a list of every dollar Silas had stolen from my accounts years ago. The total was staggering. I had kept the receipts for a moment just like this. The back door of the kitchen opened, letting in a swirl of snow. Elena entered, shaking her coat and looking troubled. She had been checking the perimeter fence near the steep ravine. She held a damp leather wallet in her hand. She found it near the driveway where the SUV was parked. I opened the wallet and found a stack of legal notices. They were not just visiting for peace. They were running from a massive corporate fraud investigation. I laid the papers out on the scarred wood table. The documents were stained with melted slush. Silas hadn't just lost his job. He had betrayed his partners and was likely facing years in prison. The alpine air outside seemed to grow colder as I read the names on the warrants. They had come to the mountains to hide behind my reputation. They thought I was a shield. They didn't realize I was actually the one holding the sword. Suddenly, the house went completely dark. The hum of the generator died, leaving us in a tomb of shadows. I heard the sound of a window shattering in the distance. Silas wasn't waiting for morning to start his games. He had found a way out of the room. He must have used the sharp shards of the pitcher to pick the lock or pry the hinges. I felt the cold wind rushing through the hallway. He wasn't just a desperate son anymore. He was a cornered animal. I reached for the heavy iron fire poker near the hearth. The iron poker was cold and heavy in my grip. I moved through the kitchen, guided by the pale moonlight reflecting off the snow outside. The house felt different in the dark. It was larger and more predatory. I reached the basement door and saw it swinging wide on its hinges. Silas had not just escaped. He had targeted the main fuse box to blind us. My pulse hammered against my throat. He was desperate to find those incriminating legal papers. I heard a frantic scratching sound coming from the pantry. It was not Silas. Bianca was huddled on the floor, clutching a silver candlestick like a weapon. Her perfect hair was a mess of tangles and dust. She looked up at me with raw, naked hatred. "You did this," she hissed, her voice trembling. "You lured us here to humiliate us." I didn't answer her. I noticed she was hiding something behind her back. It was my master's set of keys. I lunged forward and grabbed her wrist. The keys clattered onto the stone floor with a sharp, ringing sound. She tried to claw at my face, but I was faster and stronger. I pushed her back into the corner and reclaimed the brass ring. She started to sob, a jagged and ugly sound. She confessed that Silas had a gun in his suitcase. He didn't just want a place to hide. He wanted to force me to sign the deed. The front door groaned as a fresh gust of wind hit the hall. I ran toward the main entrance, my boots echoing on the wood. I saw a shadow moving near the office desk. Silas was tearing through my files, his breathing heavy and ragged. He held a small black pistol in his right hand. The metal glinted in the moonlight. He looked up, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He didn't look like my son anymore. He looked like a ghost. "Put the gun down, Silas," I said firmly. My voice was a low, steady anchor in the chaos. He laughed, a bitter sound that lacked any real warmth. He told me that the bank was closing in on him by morning. He needed the villa as collateral for a new loan. I realized then that his love had always been a transaction. He didn't see a mother. He saw a lifeline to drown. I took a step closer into the room. Silas raised the weapon, pointing it directly at my chest. His hand was shaking, but his gaze was locked on mine. "Just sign the papers, rated?" I looked past him at the photo wall. The faces of the survivors seemed to watch us from the shadows. They had endured worse than a coward with a stolen gun. I told him that the house was no longer mine to give. It belonged to the trust. His face went completely gray. A siren wailed in the distance, echoing through the mountain pass. The blue and red lights began to dance against the frosted windows. I hadn't called the police. But someone else had. Margaret had seen the weapons in the struggle and used her emergency line. I looked at the kitchen door and saw Margaret holding a cell phone. She had been watching from the hallway the entire time. Silas panicked and turned toward the back exit. He didn't see the patch of black ice on the porch. He slipped and fell hard onto the stone. The gun skittered across the frozen stone with a metallic chime. Silas groaned, clutching his shoulder where it had struck the porch railing. I moved instantly, kicking the weapon into the deep snow bank beside the stairs. The mountain cold bit into my skin as I stood over him. He looked small against the vast, dark sky. Behind me, the blue lights grew blindingly bright against the white pines. My sun was broken, but the danger was far from over. Bianca screamed from inside the house. Shrill sound that pierced the night. She had seen the police cruisers carving through the blizzard. I ignored her and focused on Silas. He tried to crawl toward the SUV, but his legs were tangled in his heavy coat. I reached down and grabbed his collar, pulling him back toward the light. He looked at me with a desperate, wild plea. He was looking for a mother who no longer existed. The local sergeant stepped out of the lead car, his hand on his holster. He knew this villa and the women who lived here. He didn't see a family reunion. He saw a crime scene in the making. I handed him the stack of corporate fraud papers I had recovered from the table. The wind whipped the pages, making them snap like small firecrackers. The officer scanned the warrants and looked at Silas. The power dynamic had shifted completely. "He's my son," I said, my voice cutting through the howl of the wind. I didn't say it with love. I said it with the cold weight of a final verdict. Silas began to weep, his tears freezing on his pale cheeks. He admitted that the money was gone. He had gambled it away on a high-stakes real estate venture that failed. Bianca emerged from the house, her face a mask of pure terror. She realized the game was finished. The sergeant signaled his partner to cuff Silas. The metal clicked shut, a final sound that signaled the end of my biological legacy. Bianca tried to run toward the woods, but Margaret was already blocking the path. The older woman stood tall, her presence as immovable as the mountain itself. We watched as they were led toward the waiting cars. The villa stood silent behind us, its windows glowing like golden embers. My sanctuary had held its ground. As the cars began to pull away, a second SUV appeared from the darkness. It was a black vehicle with no markings or official lights. It stopped near the edge of my property line. A tall man in a gray suit stepped out, holding a tablet. He didn't look like a policeman. He looked like a predator from a different world altogether. He ignored the arrests happening in front of him. He was looking directly at the villa's main hall. The man walked toward me, his boots crunching rhythmically on the fresh snow. He stopped 5 feet away and showed me a digital screen. It displayed a private contract I had signed years ago in a moment of extreme weakness. I had forgotten the fine print regarding the land rights. He told me that Silas hadn't just embezzled corporate funds. He had used my own signature to sell the mountain itself. The ground beneath my feet felt like it was vanishing. The digital screen glowed with a predatory blue light against the snow. I recognized my own cursive loop at the bottom of the page. It was a document from the year my husband died. Silas had brought me a stack of papers while I was sedated with grief. I thought I was signing insurance claims. Instead, I had granted him the right to leverage the very soil beneath this retreat. The man in the gray suit didn't blink. "The grace period ended at midnight," the man said. His voice was as mechanical as a clock. He represented a private equity firm that specialized in distressed assets. They didn't care about the women inside or the recovery mission. To them, this was merely prime alpine acreage for a boutique hotel. I felt the heat of fury rising in my chest. Silas was being loaded into the cruiser, but his greed had left a lingering poison. I stepped closer to the man. Refusing to look down at the tablet again, I told him that this land was held in a protected communal trust. He smiled thinly and pointed to a clause buried in the third paragraph. The trust was secondary to the original lion Silas had created. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Margaret and Luna stood on the porch, watching their future hang by a single, digital thread. "We have 3 days to vacate," I whispered to the cold air. The man nodded and turned back toward his black SUV. He didn't see the women moving behind him. They weren't cowering in the shadows anymore. Margaret walked down the steps, holding a heavy ledger bound in weathered leather. She wasn't just a resident. She was the former chief financial officer for a global shipping firm. She had been auditing my files for months. Margaret tapped the man on his shoulder with a firm, bony finger. She didn't wait for him to speak. She opened her ledger to a page dated 5 years ago. It showed a series of illegal wire transfers from the equity firm to Silas's private accounts. These were kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. The man's composed face finally cracked into a mask of genuine concern. The hunter had suddenly become the prey in our mountain court. "This contract is the fruit of a criminal conspiracy," Margaret declared. Her voice was a sharp blade that cut through the wind. She had documented every cent of the laundered money. If the firm tried to seize the land, she would hand the evidence to the federal prosecutors. The man in the gray suit looked at the ledger, then at the police cars. He realized the cost of this property had just become far too high. He reclaimed his tablet and walked away without another word. The black SUV sped off into the blizzard, leaving us in a swirling cloud of white. We stood together on the gravel, 5 women against the world. Silas was gone, and the debt was a phantom. I felt a strange, hollow lightness in my soul. Then, I noticed a small, red light blinking in the woods. A hidden camera was recording us from the trees. The red light pulsed like a steady, mocking heartbeat in the pines. I didn't point it out to Margaret immediately. My hand tightened on the iron poker as I calculated the distance to the tree line. Someone had been watching our entire stand from the safety of the dark woods. It wasn't just Silas or the man in the gray suit. This felt like a deeper intrusion into our sanctuary. I moved toward the porch steps, my boots crunching softly on the new snow. Margaret followed my gaze and stiffened beside me. She didn't need an explanation to see the danger. We stood together while the wind died down to a low, eerie hiss. I felt a sudden, sharp prickling on the back of my neck. We were being recorded for more than just legal leverage. This was a surveillance operation designed to find our weaknesses. I stepped off the porch and began to walk toward the red glow. The forest seemed to lean in. The snow was deeper here, pulling at my ankles with every step. I reached the trunk of an ancient, gnarled pine tree. Mounted on a low branch was a small, high-tech camera with a long, range antenna. I reached up and ripped the device from its mount with a jagged snap. The red light flickered once and then went dark in my palm. I turned it over, looking for a manufacturer name or a serial number. It was completely unmarked. I walked back to the kitchen, the device heavy in my pocket. The women gathered around the table, their faces tight with a new kind of fear. We had defeated the debt and the sun, but the mountains still felt watched. I placed the camera on the wood and grabbed a heavy mallet. One strike shattered the plastic casing, revealing a complex green circuit board. A tiny micro SIM card slid across the table. Luna picked it up with shaking fingers. "This isn't for a security firm," Luna whispered. She had worked in telecommunications before her world fell apart. She pointed to a specific encryption mark on the chip's edge. This was a private feed linked to a server in the city. I realized the man in the gray suit was just a distraction. The real threat was someone who knew our daily routines. Someone who knew exactly when the guards were off duty. I felt the walls closing in. I looked at the photos on the wall again. My eyes landed on the image of a woman who had left us 6 months ago. She had claimed she was moving to the coast for a new job. Now, I wondered if she had ever really left at all. I asked Margaret to check the security logs for the back gate. We needed to know if any other devices were hidden in our perimeter. The sanctuary was no longer a secret. Margaret typed quickly on her laptop, her brow furrowed in concentration. She found a series of unauthorized logins from a remote IP address. Someone had been watching the communal kitchen through our own internal Wi-Fi. They saw us eating, talking, and healing together every single night. The violation felt like a physical blow to my stomach. I realized we were being packaged as a product for someone else's entertainment. We were a human zoo for the wealthy. I stood up and grabbed my heavy winter coat. I told the women to lock every window and stay in the main hall. I was going to the old guard shack at the edge of the property. There was a hardwired kill switch for the entire network located there. I needed to cut the signal before they saw our next move. Margaret handed me a handheld radio and a flashlight. Her grip was firm and steady. "Be careful," she said. The walk to the shack was a blur of shadows and biting cold. I reached the small wooden structure and kicked the door open. The air inside smelled of dust and old copper. I found the main lever and pulled it down with all my strength. The hum of the property died instantly, plunging the woods into a deep, true silence. I waited for my breathing to slow down. I was alone in the dark, miles from any help. A soft click sounded behind me in the shadows of the shack. Turned the flashlight toward the corner and gasped. A man was sitting in a folding chair, his face obscured by a dark hood. He held a tablet that was still glowing with a backup satellite feed. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked bored. He stood up slowly and held out a hand for the flashlight. "You shouldn't have done that, Raven," he said. The beam of my flashlight trembled as it hit the man's face. He was younger than I expected, with a jagged scar across his chin. He didn't flinch at the blinding light. Instead, he checked his watch with a casual, annoying flick of his wrist. He was a professional, a technical mercenary hired to bridge the gap between Silas and the equity firm. My heart thrashed in my chest like a trapped bird. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to finish a job. I kept the iron poker leveled at his throat. My grip slick with sweat. He stepped toward me, and I smelled the sharp scent of ozone and cheap coffee. He told me the backup satellite feed was already transmitting to a second location. My attempt to cut the power was a futile gesture in a game I didn't understand. He reached for a small device on his belt. I prepared to swing, but he held up a laminated ID card instead. He was a private investigator. He wasn't working for Silas or the equity firm after all. His name was Miller, and he had been trailing Bianca for 3 months. He told me that my daughter-in-law was the real mastermind behind the embezzlement scheme. Silas was just a weak-willed puppet she used to sign the forged documents. I felt a cold wave of shock wash over me. My son was a fool, but Bianca was a predator. She had planned this mountain invasion as her final exit strategy. Miller tapped the screen of his tablet, showing me a series of encrypted messages. They were from Bianca to an offshore account manager in the Cayman Islands. She was preparing to liquidate the villa's assets the moment I was declared unfit. She had been poisoning the women's tea with low-grade sedatives to keep them compliant. My stomach lurched at the thought of her smiling, while she harmed my family. The violation went deeper than I ever imagined. We were never safe. I turned the radio on to warn Margaret, but only static filled the small room. The investigator shook his head and pointed to a black box on the shelf. He had activated a signal jammer the moment I entered the shack. He didn't want the police or the residents to interfere with his evidence collection. He needed me to sign a witness statement right now. If I didn't, Bianca would walk free on a technicality. I looked at the pen he offered. The gravity of the choice pressed down on me like the mountain itself. If I signed, I would admit I was a criminal activity on my property. It could compromise the trust and the safety of the women I protected. Miller watched me with a neutral, unblinking expression. He didn't care about my sanctuary or my daughters. He only cared about his bounty. I realized then that every person who entered this valley wanted a piece of me. I felt alone. I took the pen and leaned over the dusty wooden bench. My signature felt like a betrayal of the peace I had spent years building. As the ink dried, a loud explosion rocked the guard shack. The windows shattered, showering us in shards of freezing glass. I fell to the floor, my ears ringing with a deafening hum. Through the smoke, I saw the orange glow of a fire. The main villa was burning. Bianca wasn't waiting for a legal victory. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the blood trickling down my forehead. Miller was already gone, disappearing into the swirling snow and shadows. I ran out of the shack and toward the ridge overlooking the house. The sight stopped the breath in my lungs. Flames were licking at the wooden eaves of the main hall. I could hear the distant screams of the women trapped inside. Bianca stood near the SUV, holding a flaming torch. She looked like a vengeful goddess. The snow under my feet turned to slush as I sprinted toward the heat. I reached the perimeter fence and saw Margaret trying to open the jammed electronic gate. The power cut had locked everyone inside the burning perimeter. I realized my own action at the kill switch had created this trap. The irony tasted like ash in my mouth. I grabbed a heavy rock and began to smash the control box. My hands were shredded by the jagged metal. I didn't stop. The gate groaned and finally slid open by a few inches. One by one, the women began to crawl through the narrow gap. They were covered in soot but alive. I looked for Luna, but she was nowhere to be found. Margaret grabbed my arm, her face frantic and pale. She pointed toward the second floor where the infirmary was located. A small figure was standing at the window, surrounded by thick, black smoke. It was Luna's daughter. Bianca had locked the nursery from the outside, to ensure I had to choose between the child and the evidence. I lunged through the wall of heat, my lungs screaming as the smoke thickened into a black veil. The stairs groaned under my weight, embers raining down like orange snow. I reached the nursery door and found it barred from the outside with a heavy iron fire tool, exactly as Bianca had intended. I kicked the obstruction away, the metal burning my palms. Inside, the child sat silently under a table, her eyes wide with shock. I scooped her up and turned back toward the stairs. The roof collapsed behind us with a roar of splintering timber. We tumbled out of the back entrance into the biting snow, just as the windows imploded. I laid the child in Luna's frantic arms and turned to find Bianca. She was standing by the SUV, her face twisted in a mask of frustrated rage. She raised the torch again, but Silas emerged from the nearby police cruiser, his hands raw where he had forced the metal pins during the fire's distraction. He didn't run to her. He walked toward me. Silas grabbed the torch from Bianca's hand and threw it into the snow. He looked at the burning ruins of my dream, then back at his wife. He finally saw the predator she was. He handed the sergeant a hidden recording device he had carried in his pocket since morning. It contained Bianca's full confession of the arson plan. The leverage had shifted one last time. Silas wasn't seeking a loan anymore. He was seeking a way to atone. The police moved in, finally securing the scene as the fire department arrived. The flames began to die under a deluge of mountain water. I stood with my chosen daughters, our shoulders touching in the cold air. The retreat was a skeleton of charred wood and ash. But the trust was safe, and the criminal evidence was absolute. Silas and Bianca were loaded into separate cars. I didn't say goodbye. I only watched the red lights fade into the heavy blizzard. 2 years later, the new villa stood taller and stronger than the first. We had built it with fireproof stone and the collective strength of 40 women. Luna's daughter played in the garden, her laughter echoing against the peaks. I sat on the porch, reading a letter from a lawyer. Silas was gone, but he had left his entire remaining estate to the trust. He had cooperated with the investigators to ensure Bianca faced the full weight of the law, trading his own freedom for the sanctuary's future. It was the only honest thing he ever did. I closed the ledger and smiled at the sun. The mountain air was finally clean and still. I looked at the photo wall in the new main hall. Every face was there, including the women who had helped me fight that night. I realized then that the lie I had told myself, that I had to be a martyr to be worthy, was dead. I didn't need to be useful to be loved. I was simply home. As I turned to go inside, a new car pulled into the driveway. A young woman stepped out, looking lost and afraid. I walked down to meet her,